he had a reputation as being difficult back then and whatever. And it's like, wow, deserved, of course. He was very difficult.
Yeah.
He did
I mean,
look
he
scary.
self-admittedly, he's
Right.
like,
He did look scary, but then he has this obvious sensitivity because if you listen to the songs where he wrote them, I think he put that wall up because he spent his entire life growing up with everyone telling him he was a fucking loser and a total piece of.
Welcome to Rock and Roll Book Club, where we discuss books by and about musicians and the music business. I'm Shelley, and on this episode, me and my co-hosts, Dave and Jen, are digging into Sing Backwards and Weep, a memoir by Screaming Trees frontman Mark Lanegan. In this book, we travel back to the Seattle music scene of the late 80s and 90s, and Lanegan takes us deep into the darkness of his addiction. There are so many WTF moments, guys. You're not going to believe it. Speaking of, we need to give you a serious content warning on this one. This episode is not safe for work. I don't recommend listening to it within earshot of children. And if you're easily offended by people prone to extreme drug use, sudden bouts of violence, and some very questionable life choices, Lanegan ain't your guy.
all right. Welcome to Rock and Roll Book Club, everyone. Super excited to be here today to discuss Mark Lanegan's autobiography, Sing Backwards and Weep. And let me just say from the get-go that this is the craziest shit I've ever read. And if I
Ditto.
were to recommend one autobiography, it might be this one because what a ride, what a guy, so many crazy stories. I mean, I can already say, even though we're just starting, that we could talk for hours and hours and hours about this book. I mean, it's about a 12-hour listen if you're listening to it, and he reads it in his incredible voice. And I feel like we could discuss it easily for 36. I mean, we could make a full-time job out of this for a week.
Yeah.
Um,
Or
No,
wow.
more.
I thought I knew Lanigan and I thought I knew about depravity and degenerate rock star. I had no idea. I was not prepared.
I mean, you
Same.
guys, this smoked Motley Crue 500
Smoked it.
times over.
Yes.
I mean, this book, I love him though. I just like, I don't know. I don't know. We'll get into it and I'll tell you my deep feels for the guy.
I can tell you I also have deep feels. I knew we were gonna line up on this, Jen, because I feel like there's, and I'll get into it, but there's some Paul Stanley elements of his reflections that
Yeah,
I
but
appreciate.
despite the fact that he's deceased, he is not an option for you, Shelley. If he were
Yeah.
alive,
Yeah.
that's a
You
hard no
can't
for
date anymore.
no, no, you don't want that.
Well,
You
and I
don't.
also don't find Will Ferrell attractive, and they look basically identical. So I
Oh
think,
yeah, they do. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think
Not an
it's out
option,
on both
Shelley.
ends. So I'm glad we don't have to fight about that at least.
Do
I have enough problems. I don't need him.
a little bit of the history of Mark Lanigan. So he originally became known as the singer of the band The Screaming Trees, and they formed in 1985 in his small town of Ellensburg, Washington. I've got one of my Screaming Trees records here. This is an old one called Buzz Factory. And the Screaming Trees are often lumped in with the Seattle grunge scene from the early 90s with Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, etc. Although the truth is they predate all of that. They started in a small town in Washington and had nothing to do with Seattle. In fact, they were on a record company based in California. They weren't affiliated with Sub Pop the same way that most of those groups were. So they do predate all of that. They had an existence prior to, although they were friendly with all of them. And in a sense, they ended up riding some coattails from bands like Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, etc., just by virtue of the fact that Seattle became the epicenter of music, and they were in the proximity of it. But it should be pointed out that they weren't from Seattle and that they weren't part of that initial scene. They're often lumped into that. In
Yeah,
addition
like
to the Screaming
says
Trees, I'm
that
sorry, did you have a
Lanegan says that he grew up, it was in Eastern Washington and it was on the wrong side of the mountains. Like,
I
like the
believe
lame
that.
part of Washington, apparently. I don't know.
After the Screaming Trees, or while the Screaming Trees were going on, and then afterwards, he did have a solo career. Here's his first solo album, The Winding Sheet. Good story in the book about this cover because he absolutely hated it and almost beat the shit out of a record company guy because of it. He had a solo career when the Screaming Trees broke up. He was a part of Queens of the Stone Age. He was a part of the Gutter Twins with Greg Dully from the band Afghan Wigs. He was part of the Twilight Singers, also with Greg Dully from the Afghan Wigs. He was with a group called the Soul Savers. He had a group called the Mark Lanegan Band, in addition to just being a solo artist. And he did a frequent number of collaborative albums with Isabel Campbell, who is one of the singers in the band Belle and Sebastian. He did leave the United States in the 2000s, and he lived in Ireland, and he was living there for the last, 15, 20 years of his life, and that is where he passed in 2022. But that's the basic career arc. He's probably still best known for the Screaming Trees, although I think on a critical level, people really do appreciate his solo music, maybe even more than they do the Trees.
I have to say, I had never listened to any of his solo albums, and wow, yeah, the bits that I listened to were fantastic. I grew up as a Screaming Trees fan, not a diehard one, but a fan nonetheless. And it's amazing how different they are and how great they are. Well, while we're on the music side of things, I want to talk a little bit about the bands that he references in the book. When it started, I was like, I'm going to make a list of all the bands that he references and maybe make a playlist out of that. And then I realized that there were too many for me to list. And that if I'm going to listen to this while I'm walking the dogs, like there's no way in hell I'm going to remember what all the bands were by the time I got home. I mean, he talks about it's a virtual who's who of that scene.
Well, it does. He talks all the bands that he was affiliated with, bands they played with on tour, and then bands that he just casually met or whatever. It does kind of run the gamut. And to me, the funniest band mentioned is the band Autograph, which from the 80s, Turn Up the Radio, which he loathed and said was the absolute epitome of everything he hated about 80s music. Then when he's in rehab, the drummer from Autograph comes over and is like, "Hey, buddy." And they ended up becoming friends. That was fucking hysterical.
I love that.
Yes.
One thing I loved about this book as well is he shares who really inspired him. And I don't want to jump ahead too much because I know we have an agenda. But when he talked about Tom Waits and Jeff Buckley and Leonard Cohen, like that, Liz Phair, is a book. Share who your interests are, share who propels you, who brings you forward. I like Mark Lanegan. I don't know what else to say.
Just to start off, also like impressions of Mark Lanegan before the book.
I knew a few of their songs. I knew nothing about him. Nothing. But you guys are like the ultimate cool kids. I was kind of off with, classic rock and Bruce Springsteen. But I will say I loved the few songs that I knew, and I've been listening to more just to kind of get familiar with it again. I knew nothing about him, but I liked him. I liked him a lot. Nothing. So David, you go because you have a better answer.
Okay. Well, no, my impression was I was a fan. I did like the Screaming Trees. When that band ended, I did kind of follow him a little bit. I saw him a couple of times. I got to meet him once officially, and that was when he was with Queens of the Stone Age. It was probably 2002, and I was living in Florida, and I got to go backstage. And I remember thinking, like, Lanegan was a huge, terrifying looking person in person. Like, okay, he's really big and he looks mean. And it was like, okay. And then I also heard that he didn't like talking about the Screaming Trees. Like, that was past tense. Don't fucking bring that up. Like, it's bad news. But that's what I wanted to talk about because that's what I knew. So I did see him standing there backstage, and I walked over to him and I was scared to death. And I was like, hey, is it cool if I ask you a question about the screaming trees? And he goes, yeah, sure. And he was nice and he wasn't scary at all. But I had heard that like he's real testy and he doesn't want to talk about that shit. He wasn't that night. So I did see him play with Queens of the Stone Age. A couple years later, he was at Sokol Underground here in Omaha with the Twilight Singers when they were doing this thing of the Twilight Singers featuring Mark Lanegan. And it was basically, the Twilight Singers show. And then at some point in the middle, Lanegan would come out for a couple of songs, do the vocals, and then he would leave. That was the two times that I actually saw him in concert. When we start talking about the book, I'll tell you by the time I think I saw him, but I wasn't 100% sure. But my impression was that I was a fan. I just didn't know too much about his life. I knew vaguely that he had a drug problem, that he was friends with Kurt Cobain. But beyond that, I didn't know a ton of the details. So I liked him, but I didn't know a lot about his personal life.
I'm in the same place as you, Dave. I was a Screaming Trees fan. I vaguely knew that he was into heroin. Just like you said, vaguely knew that. I wasn't like, I didn't think of him as an extreme heroin addict like a Lane Staley or even a Kurt Cobain. I was at that Twilight Singers show as well, and my memory of it is that basically they're like, all right, Mark Lanegan, and they just like prop him up in front of the microphone. And I don't think we saw the whites of his eyes that entire show. I mean, he was just like this. He was like, and I was like, whoa, bro, you have not kicked your heroin habit. What is happening right now?
Yeah, because we don't really know when he there's rehab at the end of the book and all that, but then we don't know for another 20 years were there relapses, were there whatever.
And then I saw him previous to that. I had seen him open for Stone Temple Pilots. Oh, and some cheesy band that was bigger than Stone Temple Pilots. Who sang that? If you want to find me flowers. Who sang that?
I know.
Shit. Spin Doctors.
Yes, that's
I was at that show. I think I was at
You were at that show?
Yeah, I believe
so that
I
was Screaming. So you saw the Screaming Trees.
Yeah, but
I saw the Screaming. So
Okay.
yeah,
I never did. I never got to see the Screaming Trees.
They opened, then Stone Temple Pilots, then the Spin Doctors, and I was there solely for Screaming Trees. And legit, they played like 5 songs and it was over. And I was like, I just paid like $60 to see the Screaming Trees play 5 songs. This is such bullshit.
But here's hours of the Spin Doctors.
So yeah, I didn't know a ton about him, and wow, lots of surprises ahead when I read this book.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I was just not prepared. I did not know how bad it got, how crazy it got for Lanegan. These are just stories you just don't think about with any sort of successful rock star. You think about dead wannabe rock stars maybe behaving in this way or having life experiences like this, but you don't think of really like what I consider to be pretty successful artists like Mark Lanegan. I mean, I think people look more fondly on the Screaming Trees in retrospect than they did at the time, because at the time music was still very image conscious, and they did have 2 really fat guys in the band. And I always felt like that was a bit of a detriment. If you look at any Screaming Trees video, whenever they show the band, they're always blurred or they're always in weird light or whatever. They never just show the fact that there's 2 fat guys in the band. I mean, they're there. You can't hide them, but the video, it was kind of like what they did with Heart in the 80s. When Ann Wilson kind of ballooned up, they tried to use lighting to not make it look like she had gained weight. Well, you can't do that with these dudes. They're 400 pounds. Like, there's no lighting is going to fix that.
So let's talk about like what did you guys think were the craziest moments in the book?
Well, I thought the overall craziest story in the book was the time where, okay, so I have to give a little bit of background. So he was living in this apartment on First Hill in Seattle, which, by the way, I lived in First Hill when I lived in Seattle too, and I did not know the reputation of this area. Like, everything in Seattle is a bunch of hills, right? There's Capitol Hill, Queen Anne Hill, First Hill, and you live on one of the hills. I knew Capitol Hill was pretty scummy. Queen Anne Hill was where my friend lived, and I lived on First Hill, and there were a lot of hospitals around, okay, which I always thought was weird, and I would hear sirens a lot at night. They point that out. It's known as Pill Hill, according to him, and that a lot of junkies spend time around there. I had no idea. However, I do remember seeing who I thought was Mark Lanegan walking down the street one day when I still lived there, holding like a bag of groceries. So in my head, I was like, well, he must live here close by, because why else would he be walking around with a bag of groceries? Now, knowing what we know now, he didn't really spend a lot of money on groceries. That was probably a bag full of heroin or some shit that he's walking around with. It probably wasn't groceries. But the point is, I thought he lived near me back then just because I saw him. And I thought he must live close. But the craziest story was, okay, he was a drug dealer out of his apartment. There was a time where he met this woman, a black woman who was a prostitute who he used to do drugs with,
Sex worker.
a sex worker, who came up with the terminology or came up with the scam of, hey, I'll go out there on the street and I'll get these guys to come in to the apartment thinking they're going to get laid. And as soon as they take their pants down, you run out with a bat and threaten to kill them. And then we take all their money. And they did this for like weeks, apparently, robbing all of these guys, assuming the guys would never come back because it would be too embarrassing for them. They don't want to tell their wife or their girlfriend or whatever what they were doing. They don't want to be embarrassed. So they just did this for the longest time. And then making that even crazier is all of a sudden this woman just disappears and he never knew what happened to her. Turns out she was the victim of a serial killer. And he found that out decades later that woman was one of the victims of some notorious serial killer up there. And it was just like, wow, the crazy. And he always wondered whatever happened to her, you know?
Well,
Yeah, he's just standing in line at a coffee shop and looks over and sees a newspaper and her picture, and he's like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Like, she got murdered. Point of clarification also, she had proposed that she charge $50 and that they would take the $50 and keep it. And Mark Lanegan was like, fuck that. We're taking all of their money.
I mean,
He's like, that's not good enough, dude. That's a missed opportunity. Like,
And the
you
fact
didn't steal everything. Why would you not steal everything?
Right. The fact that he was drug dealing out of his house when he was a rock star and he wouldn't give out what his buzzer was because he didn't want junkies buzzing his house all night long. So they would just yell at the window and be like, hey, or whatever. And then then he would go down and deal with them. It's like a fucking lunatic. And this is after he's on a major label.
I have more to add.
Yeah.
When they were, so when they're yelling down, he told everyone, stop yelling down. Just throw a pebble. Just throw a pebble up at my window and then I'll come out. I mean, this guy is the king junkie. It is unbelievable to me. I just, wow. Whew.
What did
I
you
would
think?
say that part was the craziest with the woman who they ended up pulling that scam on. And I think the other craziest moment for me was maybe when he said Mike Starr, who used to be the bass player of Alice in Chains, showed up at his house one day, obviously a complete junkie loser. He'd already been fired from Alice in Chains, was completely off the rails. He shows up in just boxer shorts and a t-shirt. He's out in public like this. He said he had shit stains on his pants. He was just gross. Lanegan let him in the house. And then the guy goes, hey, can I use your phone? And he walks around the corner and he's basically calling somebody else, talking about what Lanegan has in his house. Like he was setting them up to rob Mark Lanegan because he assumed he had a lot of drugs and money in the house. And like Lanegan only let him in there because of his association with Alice in Chains and because he was more sympathetic to junkies and drug addicts. He just let them stay there. And then this guy was about to turn around and rob him. I thought that was like a nuts moment too. And I know that Mike Starr has since died as well. He's not, among the living, but wow, those are the two most off the rails moments for me, I thought.
Mike Starr was also on Intervention.
Was he?
When they did I think, was it Intervention? That was the
Celebrity
name of it?
Rehab or Intervention?
Celebrity Rehab. That was
Oh,
it.
okay.
Yes, Celebrity Rehab. Was that the one with Dr. Drew?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually watched his season, and yeah, he seemed like he basically burnt every brain cell out of his brain from what I recall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then it
Mhm.
was just a few years later that he died of an overdose, which is really sad.
Okay, I had multiple moments that were
How could you not?
Yeah.
the
How can you limit it to one?
There's three. I'll be quick. Okay, the needle
No,
sharing.
don't be quick.
Okay, I won't. The needle sharing where him and two other guys were sharing the same needle for months. Do you remember this? They were on tour and the bus driver, were they in Japan? What happens in Japan? Nothing's good over there. Look at the crew.
I don't remember them going to. I didn't remember a specific Japan thing. I
Maybe
remembered
they were in
Australia,
But-
and Europe a lot, and
They were in
Was it when
Europe.
they were in
They-
Switzerland?
Okay.
Because that's-
Oh yeah, I'm getting to that one next. Okay.
Yeah,
so-
that's on my list too.
Okay, the sharing of needles. The needle was buried and up in the bus. He went in to find it in the dark. It turned out the bus driver was sleeping in the hidden pocket above
Oh,
where the
yeah.
needle was. He found the needle. I think he jabbed it into the bus driver's arm or jabbed it somewhere on the bus driver. And then they pulled it out. They went out and they used the freaking same needle, like for months. He said 3 months, one needle.
And it's like getting dull. They're like, ah.
Yeah, he said he was
It is-
trying to like sharpen it on like a rock or something. I mean, it's like you can't do that to a
Yes.
needle. I mean,
Okay.
that's just nuts, right? I know very little about needles. I feel like that I'm confident that that's true. You cannot sharpen a needle on a rock.
And nor should you.
Never tried. Maybe
yeah.
that's on my
No,
to-do
no,
No,
list
never
for
tried either.
later.
The second part was where I think he was in Switzerland and he was strung out yet again, but this was the worst extreme. He's combing the streets and like this, it was a kind of a quaint little town. And he bumps into the guy on the bicycle who had Tourette's. And then,
Yes.
do you remember this? And then they went
so
back to his place. And if you remember in the beginning, Lanegan would steal a bike every day and he'd throw him down in the creek. He'd steal a bike, throw it in the creek. Then he's with some girl. He's in high school. And he's with some girl in the car and she goes out to do something. And she's like, oh my God, you have to see these bikes. And it's all of his bikes that
he
he
had
stole
stolen.
every freaking day. So he goes to this guy's house, the guy with Tourette's and who had his own share of problems, but and his apartment was full of bikes and parts and all of that. And then he ended up, getting his heroin fixed from this guy and finding a connection through this guy. I mean, what the fuck? And then the other story was Pablo, his brother-in-law, who they
Ooh.
found out years later, or like when the kids were at home, the sister found journals where he had written like these horrible sex fantasy.
See,
Yeah,
Yeah,
about killing her and stuff, right?
And every story ended with him killing her or someone killing her. So he was trying to get her out. And
Yeah.
she's like, I'm scared. I can't do it. We're going to go into witness protection. Like, what the hell?
and then she fucking burns them
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
because she doesn't want to get him in trouble or leave, which I
His
like,
mom.
no judgment there. I mean, abuse is insane.
I know. But the
Ugh.
whole family was just really broken, clearly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good time to talk just briefly about his early life. He says that he was born, a thief, a junkie, an alcoholic, a liar, just like his uncle who was described as a bad seed and who died of alcoholism, I believe in his early 40s. By 12 years old, Lanegan was stashing weed and porn in his room, and he was drinking beers in the closet between classes in junior high. By 18, he was a full-blown alcoholic. He talks about just like riding off on a motorcycle, I think, of all things, and waking up in a different city and not knowing where the fuck he was or how the fuck he got there. I mean, the life this guy lived before he was even,
No, his
old enough to vote was
No,
nuts.
he had a
Shit
pretty
that
horrible
most of us
upbringing.
have gotten into our whole lives.
No, his both of his parents were kind of complete pieces of shit. His dad was either indifferent or pretty negative towards him, and his mom just was like, "You're a fucking loser. Like, I want nothing." I mean, as a kid, you're saying this to your kid, like, "Fuck you, you're a loser. I don't want anything to do with you." He
Yeah.
basically was a feral kid for the most part. I mean, he was living out in a storage shed and all this stuff. I mean, he had a rough fucking life, and he had no love for his parents at all. I mean, later
Well,
on, he
his
talks about
dad a little bit.
it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Later on, I was gonna say he did kind of come around on his dad and say that he always kind of respected him a little bit, which I think was, I mean, I don't know. I can't just say what his feelings are or aren't, but I mean, it did seem a little strange. But yeah, he had no parental upbringing. I mean, to speak of. I mean, worse than Nikki Sixx. It's not like he got dumped off with the grandparents, where at least he would have had something, something better if he had another relative. He had nothing. He just had his mom, who did not give a fuck at all. Just
God, she seemed
openly
like a
hated
bitch.
him. Yeah.
Openly.
The saddest part for me was the potential he could have had with athletics. I mean, this guy, he was a star baseball player, and he could have played, gotten the hell out of there, gotten a scholarship somewhere. There was no one at home to say to him, like, you got to get good grades. You have to do this. He had no supervision, and no one cared. So any opportunity this guy has ever had, he totally fucks up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It was, and you look back, it was his addiction that was pulling him down back then, but
Yeah.
he just
Yeah.
never,
And the
But
addiction. Go ahead.
But also like the adults in his life, in addition to his parents. So he's going to be kicked off the baseball team because he failed home ec. And so the home ec teacher offers to let him take the class before school and is a complete bitch to him. And he knows the deck's already stacked against him. So he's like, fuck it. Like, she already was like, you're a piece of shit. And it's just so sad how, all of the adults were like, you're hopeless and useless and I don't give a fuck,
Well, and there was even
no
that
one
picture of someone, people walking. Oh, there's a story about how there was a prison up in Ellensburg where they lived in their small town, Washington, and they had to move the prison down the block. And there's a picture in the paper of all of the prisoners walking with their shit down the street into the new prison. And Lanigan's dad was like, it wasn't Lanigan, but saw a guy that kind of looked like him and was like, I always knew you'd fucking end up in prison. Like, just
And
assumed it was him and told him, I saw you in the paper. I knew you would end up in prison. You're a piece of shit, just like I said. And it wasn't even him. But
And
yeah,
his
he
dad
had
says
no.
at one point that he sits him down in one of the rare conversations they actually have. He sits him down and he says, his dad was actually, his parents were both teachers, which is also even more depressing. And he's like, I can see the kids that are going to end up in county, and I just know, and you're one of them. And, you're going to have to like get tough because the life you're going to live is going to be rough, which he was not wrong about that. But, telling your kid when they're like 12 or something that you're going to be a piece of shit.
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
You better
rough.
toughen
Like,
up, because when you get to big boy prison, there's no,
yeah. I mean, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's so sad. And clearly, and I think other people will take this away from the book. He's a super smart guy. He's a super talented guy.
Mhm.
And he is tough as shit,
Yeah.
and you can't help but feel like, yeah, his addiction would have still been an element likely in his life, but I don't feel like it would be to the same extent if he actually had some adult guidance.
No,
I
and
agree.
I think the point about the baseball and that Jen brought up about how if he had some encouragement at home or some support, maybe he could have parlayed that into something and had like a legitimate sort of normal life. He could have gotten a college
Right.
scholarship, could have played baseball, whatever. Wouldn't have been, I mean, maybe we wouldn't know him in music or whatever, or maybe he would have done music anyways. But point is, he had nothing. And so what did he see is that, what was the positive outlook from him to be like, I mean, like, I'm surprised in a piece of shit town like Ellensburg that he even hooked up with anybody remotely decent that he could form a band with and get the hell out. Because ultimately he did at some point with these guys for the Screaming Trees, who were all from his little town, and they weren't guys that he even got along with all that well. But he recognized something. I mean, even in Lee, who he trashes throughout the book, said that first time that they met, he was mesmerized by the fact that this guy wrote his own music. He wrote his own songs and made tapes in his room. He was like impressed with that. Like nobody does that shit around here in this dumpy little town. Like I can't imagine, I can't believe somebody's doing this. So he did, I guess, meet up with the three other people in his city that were not completely destined for failure and whatever, and was able to do something. He got lucky on that regard, but man.
Well, but I think also when he connected with them, with Fuck You, Gary's sons, it's Vance and Lee. When he connected with them, right? Vance and Lee.
Van and Lee.
Yeah.
Van and Lee.
Van and Lee. Okay.
Mark.
Their mother, like they invited him over, he had dinner, right? And then
Yeah.
I think mom was like, listen, you need to hook up with my kid. He's writing all this great music and he needs someone to sing it. And that was probably one of the first breaks he ever had of anyone showing that they cared about him. Now, I know the baseball coach really tried to a little bit in a couple of parts, but he
got that teacher to give him a redo on the class. I mean, at least that was like something of like, he extended a little effort to say, hey, could you let him take the class over so he can continue to play? And then when that didn't pan out, he just was like, Lanegan was like, fuck, I'm fuck baseball. I'm out of here. It's done. And I doubt he ever played again.
No, I'm sure he didn't. He threw in the towel quick.
Yeah.
I have to say, and I shouldn't laugh at this, but I did when I was listening to the book. He says something like, when I was in high school, aside from getting drunk, getting high, and getting laid, baseball is what I lived for. It's like, oh my God, dude. Like, I mean, aside from the minor things of having all the sex, doing all the drugs, and getting wasted all the time, baseball was great.
But that's not abnormal. Listen, my brother played baseball all through college. I knew many of those guys, but I think he just kicked himself when he was down. Any break he ever had, he just didn't take it.
I also just
one other thing to build on what you were saying, Dave and Jen, about the other dudes in the band. I think it's so funny because he was friends with Van and Mark, and they were going to kick Lee out. Right. And he hears Lee's music and he convinces them to keep him in the band. And then like the next, like 2 minutes later, he's like, and you know what? I hated that dude. He sucked. It's like, we did not get along. And it's like, well, you did this, man. But
but he, at least he recognized they needed him.
Yeah.
He was the one who was writing original music. There's no future in doing cover songs or doing whatever, or just playing Ramon songs in your garage. If you're going to do something in music, you have to come up with original songs, and at least he figured it out. Also, Connor, as much as like fuck you, Gary, and all of that, Connor's parents were at least somewhat encouraging. They weren't total pieces of shit. They tolerated a lot. His mom was saying, hey, you should interact with my son. He's really talented. Nobody else seemed to think he was. They all thought he was a big fat loser. But his mom was like, no, he has something here. You should go connect with him and encourage. And that it worked, right? Because the Connor's parents weren't total garbage. Those guys probably would have had a life outside of the Screaming Trees. Mark Lanegan, probably not. If he hadn't escaped that town with the band, who knows he would have gone to prison or been dead, probably in his early 20s.
Agreed. Yes.
He had no future there.
He did come pretty close to being dead a bunch of times. One of the craziest stories that I thought was when he got a blood infection from shooting up, and it goes to the hospital and they take off his shirt, and there's like the red line getting closer to his heart, and like coming up his arm, right? So like he shoots up and it's like redness is coming up. And if that gets to your heart, like you're fucked. Like then it just shoots infection throughout your body and you're dead.
Weren't they almost going to cut off his arm too?
Well, yeah, that's what I was getting to. So they tell him, the doctor like draws like an area, and he's like, if that redness does not get below this area in 12 hours, like you're going to lose your right arm, which was his dominant arm. And then it's like, and it's one of those stories, like so many of them in the book, where you think, this has got to be the craziest story in the book. I mean, my God. And then it's like
It's like,
next
hold my
chapter,
beer.
nope, doubling down, like twice as crazy, and it just keeps like snowballing to just
It's just
fucking madness.
there's just no regard for anything. He had no regard for his health, himself, his life, nothing. I think he got himself into a couple of decent relationships. I think he really loved Anna. But
Yeah.
you know, he's just a broken human.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, he had a reputation as being difficult back then and whatever, and it's like, wow, deserved, of course. He was very difficult.
Yeah.
He did
I mean,
look
himself
scary.
admittedly, he's
Right.
like,
He did look scary, and someone who has saw him in person, he was a pretty intimidating looking guy. But then he has this obvious sensitivity because if you listen to the songs where he wrote them with his lyrics and stuff, he's not just some big brute or whatever. That was, I think he put that wall up because he spent his entire life growing up with everyone telling him he was a fucking loser and a total piece of shit. And then that's why he had this hair trigger temper of you say anything that he doesn't want to hear, and he's going to kill you or at least attempt to. And
Yes.
yeah,
that's
he'll
why he
knock,
was in
knock your
so
fucking
many.
lights out.
What's that?
He'll knock your fucking lights out. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
like one dude was like asked him about was like, hey, I know your ex-girlfriend Anna, and he's like,
Smashes.
boom.
Yeah. The guy
Like,
just
that was his survival, though. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And he could fight clearly because he beat the shit out of anyone who crossed his path. I mean,
Mhm.
he had no fuse. He was a survivalist in this really strange, terrible place he was in. And I don't know. He just beat the
Well,
shit out of
I think also one of the crazier stories, and this I kind of heard of, and this isn't so crazy, but it ties in a big part of music history, is that Kurt Cobain did call Lanegan the night that he killed himself, and Lanegan didn't answer because he didn't want to deal with Courtney Love because he thought that going over
Yes.
there and dealing with that would just be too much, and he just didn't want to do it, and so he ignored the call. And not that that would have changed anything necessarily, but maybe you just don't know. But he obviously felt really shitty about that later on and lied about it to a reporter because he said he was asked by Rolling Stone, when was the last time you heard from Kurt Cobain? And he said months before. It had been like the day or so before, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he obviously felt really bad about that. That was very shocking to hear that. I feel like I might have heard that anecdotally before, but I don't think it had ever been confirmed that Kurt did call him and he blew off the call because he didn't want to deal with him at that moment and Courtney and whatever. Now, Courtney wasn't even there. So, but he didn't know that, you know.
So sad.
Really nice friendships with these guys. I mean, he was a good friend to
Mhm.
Kurt Cobain, to Chris Cornell. I mean, these guys, he respected other musicians to a certain degree if he really liked them. But I mean, you don't hear a mention of Dave fucking Grohl.
No.
You know,
No
it's like Lanegan was closer with Cobain than Grohl ever was, you know?
Although, you
You
know,
do get that sense.
one
Although they
great,
have the heroin bond.
yeah,
That's true.
yeah, the
Yeah.
heroin
They
bond with
like
the.
each other outside of their drug addiction.
There was one great story though that about Nirvana that wasn't Kurt Cobain, but it was when Chris Novoselic called up Mark Lanegan. Van had quit the Screaming Trees. Van Conner had quit the Screaming Trees. They were looking for a new bass player. And Chris Novoselic heard this, called Lanegan, and was like, "What about me? I'd like to join the band. I'm sick of Kurt. He's a tyrant. Everything has to be his way. I don't want to be in the band with him anymore." And Lanegan was like, "Look, man, we'd love to have you. You'd be great. Do not get separated from Kurt. Latch onto that dude. There's something special about that guy. Put up with whatever it is you need to put up with and stay with him." And that was some seriously wise information because
Yeah.
that changed the entire course of Chris Novoselic's life. That was very, very smart to have said,
Absolutely.
"Look, we'd love to have you in the band. You'd be great, but you should stay where you are because you're in a better situation." And that
Yeah.
was absolutely 100% true.
Yep.
And I think that's just one of the examples of where he put other people's interests in front of his own, that he talks about in the book, which just to me shows you like there's goodness inside of him, even when he's, in the depths of his addiction, that there really was a great soul
Well, he had
inside.
such a chip on his shoulder that whenever anyone showed any appreciation towards him, I mean, like when Johnny Cash told him that he sang well or whatever, and somebody, it was just like, wow, really? Like he has had no inkling that
Yeah,
that was even possible. And Kurt Cobain, who is somebody who he respected, you know, was constantly trying to help Lanigan and wanted to, because he was a fan and appreciated
yeah,
what he did. And it wasn't just like, Lanigan started seeing it a little bit as charity, which I don't think it was, but like he offered to bring Lanigan onto MTV Unplugged, which was a huge boon for the band The Meat Puppets. I don't know if people remember, but The Meat Puppets, were an 80s underground band, and then they had a mainstream period because Kurt Cobain invited them on to MTV Unplugged and then played 3 Meat Puppet songs in a Nirvana concert. He wanted to
yeah.
bring on Lanigan to do Where Did You Sleep Last Night, which
Hmm.
they had already done on the Lanigan record, but Kurt wanted to do it again with Lanigan, and Lanigan said no because he thought it was charity and he thought it was stupid. Huge miscalculation. Kurt did it, and it's one of the best moments of the entire show.
Yeah.
You know?
Do you remember when, well, of course you remember because you just read the book, but when he did, who got him on the single soundtrack? Was it Cornell?
No, that was their A&R guy tipped
Okay.
them off and said, they're screwing you at the label. You need to get on this soundtrack thing.
Mhm. And they got on it, and that soundtrack was, he said that I kind of liked the movie. I didn't think the movie was cheesy, but whatever. And Lanigan said he hated the movie. It was terrible, yada, yada. But at the same time, like he had that break and he just, any, I
The
don't know if
Screaming
it's,
Trees would have been, I mean, largely forgotten, and they would have
yeah,
been an asterisk in the Northwest music story if they hadn't been on that soundtrack.
exactly.
Because even though they kind of got screwed financially on it, because he talked about how everyone else got paid extra money, but they didn't get shit for it. That was their best known song. It propelled the album that it came on afterwards to be their biggest selling record. To this day, if you said, if someone is familiar with the Screaming Trees, they probably go, "Oh, Nearly Lost You," right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
That was,
to the
Although
mainstream world. That's their only.
he says though that letting that single out with the soundtrack fucked them because they had anticipated that that record was going to sell 600,000 units and it only sold 300,000 units because
oh,
everybody had already heard the biggest single and they could get
they
it on
got the
the
soundtrack.
single soundtrack.
There's something
He
to
didn't
that,
see
but
it that way. I mean, I would agree with you both that that was their big break, but he didn't see it that way.
no, he didn't see it that way. But I think in this case, he was wrong because if you're going from selling like 50,000 albums, which I think is what they did roughly on Uncle Anesthesia, what's leading you to think that the next album would all of a sudden sell 600,000 if not for some intervening event, i.e., the Seattle scene exploding, the single soundtrack being, you know what I mean? Like, I think it was all baked in. Those expectations were based in on the fact that Nirvana was exploding. And so factors they couldn't factor in, but I also don't think without the single soundtrack, I think that Sweet Oblivion, the album of theirs that had Nearly Lost You, would have done marginally better than Uncle Anesthesia, and that probably would have been the end of the band because they would have been dropped. That's how I see it going. Without
Mhm.
singles, it wouldn't have worked. I know Lanigan, he was entitled to his opinion, but I don't think he was right in that case. You know,
That, like, that soundtrack was so good. Like Paul Westerberg on that. Oh my God.
well, I was talking to somebody who I knew who used to be in the music business and relaying that story about how their A&R guy told Lanigan, your label is fucking you. They are not putting you on this soundtrack. Every other Seattle band is there. You need to get on this thing. And he's like, that kind of shit happens all the time. Like labels just conspire because they don't feel a certain band is the right one and they don't want to put any resources. So they just marginalize them and fuck them and it's over. And that was kind of what they were doing to the trees. And fortunately, they had a guy who probably risked his job. I mean, by doing that, by going against the company line and telling them, you need to go and do this, it saved the Screaming Trees career, ultimately. I mean, I still stand by that. Without Nearly Lost You, they would have been an asterisk, which is not to say they weren't great, because they were, but they would have been an asterisk. like Green
What
Apple
I
Quick Step or some other band that people don't remember from the Seattle. I mean, I lived there at that time. I remember all of these wannabe
Remember
bands.
that band?
Oh, of course, they were
I
coming up
don't.
at the
That's where
time
I
when
saw. I told you this book. I'm like the off ramp. I'm like, God, I've been there. I went to the off ramp and I saw Green Apple Quick Step, and
I
that
used to
song
go to
was
the
like,
off ramp all the time. Off ramp, all I mean, it was that place was crazy. It was literally off. I mean, the interstate was right there. You get off, and it's like right there.
The thing I loved about that story, though, about getting on the singles soundtrack was that the A&R guy sends Lanegan down, hat in hand, to beg to be on this album. And in true Lanegan form, he's like, "Hey, I hear we're getting screwed not being on this album. To tell you the truth, I don't even fucking want to be on it. It sounds fucking stupid.
Yeah,
But I said I do this." And then the guy's like, "Appreciate your honesty. You're in." It's like,
Yeah.
holy shit.
he did not mince words.
Okay, so one more crazy story I got to add to the list. And this is when they're in Sweden. And I don't know who the fuck he's with, but a couple other junkies. And they've been holed up in this one place, sharing the same needle and like whatever. They go looking for heroin. They meet this couple who I think they refer to as the king and queen of Sweden, not in a nice way.
Oh yes.
And then they end up running into him again. So they get heroin, they go back. They've been shooting up for a whole week and just like rinsing their syringe in a glass of water so often that it's like pink from
Yeah.
blood.
Disgusting.
And so this obnoxious couple ends up finding them. The woman bursts into the room and says how hot she is and how thirsty she is, and just picks up the glass of water and drinks it. And they're all like, just don't say anything.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God. Like,
Oh
I
God,
can't
it's so
tell you
good.
how many moments I had in this book where I was like, but what about AIDS, guys? Like, holy shit.
They weren't. I mean, they were too high to consider AIDS. Honestly, like what were they thinking about? I mean, look, I've never used a needle in my entire life, and I know something you don't share needles. Like that's just 101. That's basic shit.
We've talked a lot about crazy stories. What were the most surprising parts of the book to you guys?
There were a couple, but I think that there were the most surprising thing for me was that at the end of the book when he revealed, he goes to rehab in California and finally gets clean, at least for a while. And it was revealed that Courtney Love paid for his entire rehab stay, which is amazing and pretty commendable behavior, especially considering their past and the times in the talk about where he book where he would shoot up Courtney Love and times he tried to avoid her when she would come to his house looking for drugs. Amazing story in the book about how she convinces his landlord to let her in his house because the guy was so impressed with her celebrity and he sees Courtney Love, who's famous, and is like, "Oh, you're friends with Mark? I didn't know that. Well, hold on. If you're concerned about your friend, let's let you into his apartment." And so they just let him in when Lanegan had been dodging her calls and not answering the door for like a day or two because he didn't want to deal with her. I thought that was pretty funny. But that
Although
Courtney Love,
also he takes her up to the door and Lanegan hears them and grabs a fucking baseball bat. And he's just like, if they come in, I'm just gonna fuck them both up. Like he could have just fucking killed them right there. And
yeah,
instead she says, well, let's not invade his privacy, which I was shocked. I'm like, that's another one of those moments where it's like, wow, that could have really gone another way.
my other really surprising part of the book was really his dislike of the Screaming Trees music prior to, say, Sweet Oblivion, when was he started contributing to the lyrics. And it was like, he not only didn't say like, I didn't like that shit, it was our early day. It was like he mercilessly mocked it and was talking about how shitty the guitar always sounded and how terrible the lyrics were and this and that. And it was just shredding it. And it's like, I certainly don't agree with him on that. I mean, I could get he was creatively frustrated in the band and he had to give them an ultimatum. If you want me to stay in this band, I'm writing some fucking lyrics. Like I have to be part of the writing process. It can't just be you dictating to me what we do. I get that. But wow, his repeated criticism of how terrible he thought the Screaming Trees were was just really surprising to me. I mean, and it makes my conversation with him back in 2002 when I asked him about this, and I was afraid to ask him about the Screaming Trees, you know, because of that, because I thought he just hated, I mean, I didn't know he hated the music. I thought he just hated the guys. And then when it turns out he was willing to talk to me about it, but it was like, wow, I just was not, that was very surprising to me.
I
And
had
he,
that as one of the most surprising moments too. I was like, I had no idea that he absolutely despised that band, for the vast majority of the time they were together, and legit did take every opportunity to trash talk them in the book. I
Mhm.
mean, it was basically like, oh, hey, Mark, look at that tree over there. And he's like, you know what I fucking hate is the screaming trees.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus, man.
And
Wow.
he definitely really, really disliked Lee Connor. He talked about that a lot in the book. He thought Van was all right, you know.
He and Van
But
seem to have a good
yeah, but
relationship.
Lee he had a real problem with, and the only time he ever stuck to their defense is if somebody would make fun of them for being overweight. Like if a heckler in the crowd would make fun of them for having a fat guy in the band, he would jump in the crowd and beat the shit out of that guy. Like he was very like he's willing to defend them, but at the same time, like hated them on another level.
yeah, yeah. I can't believe he never broke his hand. Um, I will say a few of the surprising things that I was like, what? When he was with Kristen from Whole, and
Mm.
they kind of hit it off
Oh,
a little bit, and then a week later she died of a heroin overdose. That was
before
sad.
they even got to get together.
No, and
I mean, I had thought that Kristen Pfaff was Eric Erlandsen's girlfriend. Like that's how she got into the band in the first place, was because he was dating her. So they must have broken up at some point, I guess. I mean, because obviously
maybe
he
not.
Lanigan thought he had this vibe with her and they were making plans together. I don't think she would have done that if considering she was probably smart enough to know my boss, Courtney Love, is friends with Lanigan. So if I hook up with him, she's going to find out about it. And if that means I'm double timing on her partner in the band, that's bad news. So they must have broken up, but I never knew that because I always thought she was Eric Erlandsen's girlfriend until she died, but apparently not. That was new information for me.
I think you're giving them all way too much credit. I'm just saying. I don't, but with that aside, I just every time he had the chance for something, it just didn't work. Even I mean with his friends, I mean, one thing that surprised me as well is how kind he was to his friends. And that honestly, that to me was like he's a good dude. But
His
yeah,
relationship with Lane Staley was pretty interesting too. I thought it was surprising and interesting. Like I knew their partying days when the Screaming Trees would tour with Alice in Chains and that they would do so much drugs together that eventually they were separated. Like I've heard that the Alice in Chains barred Lanigan from coming on their bus and shit like that because they were like, "You're a bad influence." But the part about when Lane Staley went off into Junkie Land and never left his apartment and was like just a lost guy or whatever, when his girlfriend died and he called Lanigan and Lanigan was talking to him, he was like, "Hey, go over and live at my house. Like just go in there and I know that weirdo guy is living there, but you guys know him and whatever and just you need to be around somebody and I'll be back next month and then we'll do it." Like he showed a lot of concern. And actually, if I were the guy from Alice in Chains, why would I want to give up my penthouse, like super nice apartment and go live in squalor in Mark Lanigan's shithole crack den? But whatever, if that made him feel better. I mean,
companionship. He was going through a tragic situation. Another surprising part for me was when he finally was able to tell his mother off. They were trying to have like a little family reunion type thing. And I think she picked him up at the airport and 10 minutes later, something like that, it was just over. And he lit her up, told her off. And then I assume he probably never spoke to her again.
well, he did see her one more time because that was actually what I thought was a really sort of a heartbreaking moment, and I guess it's kind of a surprise too. Is at the very end, if you remember, Lanigan was walking around and he bumped into his parents in the course of like a 2-day period.
Yes, yes, yes,
Just
yes.
sort of
Okay.
bumped into him. And it was implied that Courtney Love somehow arranged that, like got his parents to come to Seattle to like track him down or whatever to
Yes,
convince
yes, yes.
him to go to rehab. And his mom actually did participate, and so did his dad, which was like
Okay.
that might have been the last time they ever saw each other. And he wasn't very receptive to it because he was like, fuck you, mom, or whatever. But at least that was the very last, that was the only time she ever showed anything other than contempt for her own
Yes,
son.
yes, yes, yes,
And
yes.
I thought that was another good move from Courtney Love. I mean, she's usually seen as such a shitty person, but she wasn't in these instances. With Lanegan, she wasn't. I thought the funny part was when he said, there are all these rumors that Courtney Love had Kurt Cobain killed, which is such bullshit. And he goes, if anything, it would have been the other way around.
You know what I was surprised by was just the fact that he survived all of this shit. Like, how? How? I mean, just the rough living and the brushes with death and the, just living life to score. And I just cannot believe that he never overdosed, that he made it to write this book, honestly.
Mhm.
I mean, just
No, the
nuts.
fact that he survived the 90s, especially because when he gets down to the point where he was homeless and had literally nothing. That was the part where his parents kind of tried to intervene or whatever. But like the fact that he got that low down and survived, whereas you see guys like Mike Starr or some of the others, even Lane Staley, he had the comfort of tons of dough. So he was a little bit more insulated from street life. He could afford to have somebody go get drugs for him if he wanted to, like that was like Kurt Cobain had that luxury also of like, he didn't have to go out and deal with that shit. He could pay Lanegan to do it or, somebody else to do it.
Josh Homme, who, if you look at like the videos of Screaming Trees when he's in it, I mean, he is a tiny baby boy. I mean, he looks like he's 17. He is not like the big strong dude that he looks like today. And he toddles back to the back of the bus and finds Lanegan in his like smack room and just like, I just want to watch and see what's up. And Lanegan's like, he never did any of the drugs. He just wanted to talk and see what was going on. And then the poor dude gets dragged out with Lanegan.
I was gonna say he did go with him on one of his drug shenanigans.
Yeah. And like they end up in this crack den and they think they're gonna get shot because the dudes all think that Homme's an undercover cop.
Right, because he's too clean cut. Lanegan looks like a scumbag junkie, whereas Josh Homme looks like a clean cut, like, rookie cop, like trying to get his first bust or whatever.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I also just like loved their friendship, and obviously that came back around because Lanegan was in Queens of the Stone Age for a time.
Well, and if you notice, like when they decided to get a new member, the guys did it without consulting Lanegan. They told him, we got this guy, Josh Homme. He was in the band Caius. And he goes, oh, well, I love Caius. So, okay. And he just accepted it and was like, we actually found somebody in the band he liked. And then, yeah, you're right. Their friendship did transcend because he helped out Lanegan a lot by incorporating him into Queens of the Stone Age. And I'm sure that helped him, at a really, really low period to finally get his name back out there and doing a lot of stuff. Because his solo records were pretty niche and then they didn't sell a ton. I mean, he was very underground. Queens of the Stone Age, especially, he was on that album that Dave Grohl played on too, which was their biggest high profile record. I think it was like a platinum record.
There were also a lot of heartbreaking moments in this book, I think. What did you guys think? What heartbreaking moments stood out to you, I should say?
There were two, I guess. I mean, there were plenty, but I mean, two sort of stand out. The one was really when his parents finally came around at the end, and were trying to help him, at the end when they were searching for him, when Courtney brought them to Seattle and whatever. I was kind of like, okay, that says a little something about their parents. They didn't totally hate him. They really wanted to help him. But the other part was kind of when he starts dating Celine from 7 Year Bitch, or they have this attraction or whatever, and he senses this is something, but then he kind of goes back to his ex-girlfriend and just blows her off. And that really wasn't a viable option going with that ex-girlfriend. It was just a bizarre obsession that he had. And he pissed away a potential real relationship that could have gone somewhere and done something over this weird obsession that he had with an ex who really didn't want him. I mean, I think she had mixed feelings too, but ultimately, I thought that was kind of heartbreaking because maybe that would have been the one. Anna clearly wasn't, but maybe this Celine from 7 Year Bitch, who I have seen in person, and she is stunning looking. Her face is like incredible. I could have seen myself falling in love with that woman too. Like she was just cool as fuck, but he blew it. And
Can I
maybe
add
that
to
could have been.
that? Because one of the most heartbreaking moments I thought has to do with her. It's when they get together and I think they're in like the bathtub or something, and she just looks at him and says, "What is it that makes you so sad?" And he
Yeah.
was like, like he felt it physically, and then he says that was the first time he'd cried in front of anyone.
It was
And
one tear, right? It was one lone tear,
yeah, and he's like,
right?
that's the first time I cried in front of anyone. And it was, yeah, barely cry. And that just was so heartbreaking in so many ways because, first of all, the fact that she could just see the sadness is like, oh man. And the fact that he had never cried in front of anyone,
No.
and
And
the fact that he knew just what she meant, and then also just learning later that it wasn't going to work out with them, even though I feel like a moment like that where somebody can see inside of your soul that way, they had such a strong connection, and I was just so sad that they
he
couldn't
expressed
end
everything
up
through
together.
anger and violence. And so
Yeah.
this was a situation where he didn't. And it was somebody who got down to the core of it. Most people probably just thought Lanegan was an angry dickhead. And turns out he
Mhm.
was a sad, angry dickhead, maybe, and that
Yeah.
was what his problem was. It was at the core, it was because he was just so broken. And yeah, I thought they had potential there. I mean, look, what do I know? I mean,
How he went to help his sister. Every time she needed something, I felt like he was there for her. And whether or not she took the help, so be it. And she did some pretty shitty things to him, like when she stole all his stuff and whatever. But I feel like he really had a good heart of trying to protect his sister. Also, when it was disclosed that Courtney Love paid for the rehab, I was like, I was not expecting that
no.
at all. So those I would say are probably my two moments, honestly.
That reminds me of the story of how his sister, yeah, shows up to his apartment, steals all his shit. And he's like, yeah, I was used to her just taking whatever she wanted, but she took my sleeping bag. And that was the one thing that I took everywhere with me. And even when we slept in hotels, I slept inside of that sleeping bag. And so he's like, where the fuck is my sleeping bag? And she's like, it's on a boat. And
Yeah.
she's like, I can tell you how to get to the boat. And he's like, done.
Yeah,
And
he
he
went there to get it.
gets his ass out to the harbor somehow and fucking rows out to this boat and climbs aboard with his girlfriend. And then not only does he go to these extreme lengths to get his sleeping bag, but they decide it's kind of romantic while we're here. They have sex on the boat. He doesn't realize that his naked ass is rubbing up against fucking fiberglass.
Yeah.
And his ass is on fire for like a week. Like he's like, I don't have time to go to the ER to get people to
Oh my God.
take out all these tiny shards of fiberglass, and he just deals with it. Like, holy shit. I mean, and this tells you how crazy this book is that like that wasn't even the craziest
Oh,
story.
nowhere near. Yeah, we haven't even touched on some of them. In a minute, Shelley.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna need a minute for this one. So, first of all, I just want to say that you have a problem if you put bags of heroin in your mouth that were previously stored underneath another man's foreskin. So I just want to say that because
Should go
wow,
without
like
saying.
should go without saying, but apparently in England they could just check you for anything, and you had to make sure that your heroin was hidden. For the uncut population, a hiding place was underneath the foreskin. And,
Yeah, those
did not know
circumcised
that.
folks, that's not the, you don't know that, you don't know that trick.
Right. Talk about things I learned from this book. I did not know that
I
that was
learned that as
a
well.
for anything, frankly. And then, unfortunately for Mark Lanegan, he was circumcised, and so he had to put them in his mouth, and did not seem to have a problem with that. So that, I think, is really like, if you get to that point, you have a problem. On the topic of heroin, I just got to thinking about how much it took away from Lanigan's life. And Jen, you mentioned this before too. Like, it literally took everything that he had. It took baseball, it took career opportunities, record deals, relationships, his home. I mean, nearly his life so many times. Like, it is just crazy when you start to think about what would his life have looked like if he hadn't had this horrible struggle with addiction. And that truly is so heartbreaking to me. All of that said, though, his perseverance is just incredible. The fact that he lived through all of that is amazing. And the fact that he produced so much music amid all of, how do you do that? Especially when he gets to this point where he is just locked in this prison of heroin use, where the only thing is trying to find a fix so that you don't get sick, and calculating how long it's going to take before you start to get sick if you don't find it. Just, oh my gosh, I cannot believe he lived through that. And then on top of that, and truly, I think the biggest takeaway for me of the book is how much he evolved after he got clean. This book stands in stark contrast to the Motley Crue book, where, Lanigan's looking back, reflecting in a really mature and evolved way. He's not just telling stories of like, I got fucking fucked up, this is so crazy,
Yeah.
It's
And that was
like,
crazy, all that heroin, all those chicks.
yeah, right. And instead it's really him looking back as someone who seems like a fully formed human, like Paul Stanley, that can look back and be like, I made so many mistakes, and this was really fucked up the way that I lived. And to see his redemption, I think, was just absolutely amazing.
But he spent so much time in his life, like building up this wall that you didn't know anything about. Like we all said, we've known him for decades. We didn't even really know anything about him. Like, he did have this wall up. He never really revealed that sense, that other side, or this reflect, until this book, really. You couldn't even tell in the music, because you don't. I always assume that songwriters' lyrics are autobiographical. I always assume that, and that's a mistake to assume, because they're creative people, and you can write a book that's not about your personal experience, just the same way you can write a song that's not about your personal experience. So I always assume that it's about them and whatever, and it wasn't. You really didn't get to know Mark Lanegan that much until this book, and now you feel like, wow. Then now that he's gone, it's like you wish you knew some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I really wish that, this book could have gone on and on and on. We end on the death of Lane Staley, and that's like 2002, I
Something like
think.
that, yeah.
And I was like, wait, it's over? I wanted to know so much more. I just really could have listened to him forever. It was an
Especially
incredible
because he had
book.
so much career afterwards. Even if you don't know about his life, we don't know what his life was like for that last 20 years of his life, because he died in 2022, because there's no book apparently that details that last 20 years. But we have the music afterwards, and there is a ton of stuff. All those groups I mentioned at the beginning, with Queens of the Stone Age and the Soul Savers, the Mark Lanegan Band, and his records with Isabel Campbell, and all of his
10
various
solo albums.
his solo albums, and all of his appearances on various people's projects and stuff. And just so much great music. And there is a playlist that will be linked below, sharing my Mark Lanegan playlist, which, total candor, I didn't make just for this. I did make it after he died, but hey, serves a dual purpose. It's got
Yeah.
Screaming Trees, it's got Mark Lanegan solo, Queens of the Stone Age, etc. So it's got all that stuff. It is linked
And
below.
as always, it's phenomenal. Like another great playlist,
Yeah.
Dave. Thank you. I've
Yes.
been listening to that for the last, well, ever since you sent it. How have your impressions changed about him now that we've read this absolutely nutso book?
He's a survivor. I mean, this guy made it. And, when he got clean, the little that we found out, it was humbling. And, I think he had a will to live. He just had to find it.
No, my
Yeah.
impressions didn't really change. I mean, I liked him as an artist always beforehand, and I still do. I maybe have a touch more empathy for his life situation, of which I had no idea. I'm not going to let his view of the Screaming Trees taint my view of the Screaming Trees, which is that I really like that band, and I don't care that he didn't like it. I mean, tough noogies, buddy. I think that stuff is really good. I mean,
Yeah.
there you go.
My impression of him has changed a lot. I respect him as a musician a lot more, because thank you, Dave, for the playlist. I've listened to more of his solo stuff, and I just think he's great. He was way more of a junkie than I thought that he was.
Mhm.
You think about, well, if they live, it was probably just like for fun, but no. And also I just, like I already said, I'm impressed with how thoughtful and reflective and mature he is, and am impressed by how much he's clearly had learned since he got clean and evolved and changed, and I really admire him for that.
You think of all of these wild rock stars from the 80s and 90s and stuff, and it's like none of them that I'm aware of really got that out of control like Lanegan, where he was literally living hand to mouth. He was a crack dealer out of his apartment. He was ripping off Johns with some junkie woman that he was friends with. He was doing all of this sketchy shit, just unbelievable. But the fact that his music was so significant to people that people wanted to help him. Courtney Love helped him with rehab. Duff McKagan hired him to manage his house, to just,
Yeah.
hey, just be my house guy or whatever. When my family's not there, watch the house. And when they come to stay in this house, then you go to the other house. And it was like, just out of generosity, just stuff was like, just do it, just
Yeah.
he wanted to help him. So people who are just like, they so appreciated what he did that they want, and it maybe part of that calming was the fact that he finally felt some sense of respect. I mean, self-respect. He didn't feel like such a fucking loser, who barely escaped going to prison. It was like, no, I'm an artist. People respect what I'm doing. It's so hopefully that's how it went for him, I would think.
And well, I think one thing that we should add is he does have a second book, but it is only about his experience getting COVID and being in a coma for months on end. And I
Died anyway.
yeah, and then so that was 2020, I believe, when he got COVID, and then yeah, he died in 2022. I couldn't find a cause of death listed anywhere, but it did not seem like it was COVID related.
No, but his immune system and everything could have been so weakened from all his years of
Yeah.
the drugs and the unhealthy living, and that even if you start, it's like if you smoke cigarettes for 40 years and then you stop for 2 years, that's better than continuing, but it's certainly not going to just undo the 40 years of damage that you did to yourself. I imagine he was in poor health. Yeah, great book. Again, very well written. The audiobook read by Lanegan himself, which is always a nice bonus. So we obviously you get to hear it in his voice, and he's got a good, interesting. I mean, I don't know that those are. I don't know. My final thoughts were just it was a great book, and I had no idea how rough Mark Lanegan's life was.
Yeah,
Jen?
I'm with Dave on that. It was a fantastic book. I encourage anybody to read it. It just, I couldn't, because I listened as well, and I could not stop listening. And his kind of monotone, like he really didn't have a whole lot of, range in how he read it. I mean, you really felt like you were living everything with him in that moment.
Like he's just sitting
And
there telling you stories in a room with you.
Mhm.
yeah,
Like
I'm like,
this audiobook was really good because it is like him just sitting in a room with you recounting this crazy stories, but he was saying it very dispassionately of just like, this is kind of what happened. These
yeah,
things
and
all
this is what
happened.
I do. This is what
Right.
I do. Beat
He
the shit
never
out
got
of
really worked up about it or anything
No,
like that.
nothing. I thought it was incredible. I again, great book, and fuck you, Gary. It's
Yeah, I think that he could have had a whole second career reading bedtime stories, because if he weren't talking about all this crazy shit, you really could like fall asleep nicely to his
yeah,
voice.
yeah.
It really
Does
is an
read well.
incredible listen. And I agree with you guys. The book was fantastic, and I'd recommend it to anyone, even if they don't know who Mark Lanegan is. And so far, it really has been my favorite book. And I'm not just saying that because it
It's a
was my
compelling story.
Dave, what are we reading next?
Okay. I had picked this out a few months ago because remember in the last video I said I already know what it is. And then I was kind of hedging after reading Lanigan, and I was like, maybe I should change it, but I didn't change it. We're gonna do this one, Trouble Boys, the story of the replacements. Now, this is different from any of our other books because this isn't a biography, an autobiography, or a memoir. It's written by an author who interviewed a couple members of the band and tells the story of this one of my favorite bands of all time. It is on audiobook, FYI, not read by any of the guys in the band. It's read by somebody else. But I've read this book 7, 8 years ago when it came out. It is incredible, and I can't wait for you guys to read it and for us to discuss it on the next episode.
Can
Yeah.
you send me a playlist now? Because I don't hate me. I don't have a huge history with the replacements.
That's fine. That's fine.
I was
Because
gonna
I
ask
am very curious to know if this book affects you guys the same way it affected me, which was I was a diehard fan and I learned so much in this book, kind of like the Paul Stanley, where it was just like, wow, I didn't know any of this shit before. I learned a lot from that and it made me love the band even more. I'm curious to see how the effect it'll have on you guys who aren't coming at it from a super fan perspective, just coming at it from we're all in this book club and whatever. But yeah, I'll get on that playlist.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
that'd be awesome.
I,
Thank you.
I love the replacements. And, whereas I know probably 5, 6 songs, I've always wanted to do a deeper dive. And I'm very, very happy with your selection, Dave.
All right, cool.
Me too. I'm excited. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed reading this book. My God. As always, would love it if you would like this episode, subscribe to our channel. If you haven't already, check out some of our other books that we've discussed, and hope to see you back next time. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye.